In this video, we're going to take a look at the brush panel, which allows you to really change the behavior of your brushes inside of Photoshop. Now, I have already opened up a very large canvas, 15 inches by 15 inches at 72 DPI, so it's pretty big. It'll give us a lot of room to play around on. And what I'm going to do is jump over to my brush presets drop-down, which we've taken a look at earlier. It's what allows you to choose through all the different brushes you have access to. And I'm just going to grab any one of the basic brushes I see. In fact, this basic soft round, which is 48 pixels, will be just fine for my purposes. We can click and drag and we can see what that does. Now I'm going to hit Control Alt-Z a couple of times to get rid of those strokes. And then I'm going to open up the brushes panel. There's a couple of ways to do this. Currently, I can see the brush panel over here inside my panels area. However, if you are using the standard Essentials layout, you won't see that. If you have the brush tool active, and if you don't, you can hit the B key, you can take a look up here at the top and see Toggle the Brush Panel. So if we click that, here you go. Now by default, the brush panel is probably not going to be quite this large on your screen. I am using kind of a low resolution. But what I want to do is just kind of go over the general interface of what you're going to find here inside this window. I'm not going to go over each and every individual setting. There are enough that we'd actually be here for quite some time. On the left, you have a list of the various types of settings you can control. Starting at the very top, you have brush tip shape. It's fun to try to say that, isn't it? Now, when you click on this, you have a listing of all the different brush presets you have access to. This is analogous to your brush preset list that we've been playing with up to this point in previous videos, and you can choose which of the following brushes you'd like to modify. Now also inside this window, you'll see settings for the size of the brush, which you can adjust, and you'll notice you get this really nice preview window down here at the bottom that allows you to see what your brush stroke is going to end up looking like as you change each one of these settings. Very, very useful. Now it only gets so big, so at some point you can't just make it sit there and keep getting more and more extremely large. Now there's some other controls here that are not going to be readily apparent until we play with others, so what I'm going to do is kind of jump around a little bit. Size is pretty easy. And again, while I did say I wasn't going to go over each one of these settings, I will cover the ones here in brush tip shape. Also, I want to point this out because this is something that has to do with Photoshop's interface. You'll notice I can punch in a specific value for my brush pixel size, so I could say set that to 35 pixels exactly. But wherever you see an entry box like this with a label, most of the time inside of Photoshop you can click and drag on that label and it's just like working the slider. So here I'm just clicking on the word size and I can click and drag and change that number around. Very, very handy feature. Now spacing is currently active, and what spacing does, actually if you increase it, it starts to become more apparent. This controls how frequent the stamps of your brush stroke are going to take place. Now if you didn't know, when you're actually clicking and dragging and drawing out your brush strokes like so, you're not creating one contiguous line. What you're actually doing is creating a highly repeated series of stamps. And by increasing the spacing, you're basically slowing down how often those stamps get placed. So you can create a dotted line very quickly and easily. And if you really stretch it out, you can have a very dotted line with huge spacing in between. Now I'm going to hit Control Alt-Z a few times to clear all that out. So you can see what spacing does. If you don't want to mess with spacing, just switch it off and you'll get kind of a random scattering like this. But we'll go ahead and leave spacing on. Now if I leave spacing on and kind of spread these dots out a little bit, let's also hit Control-Z to get rid of that one stroke. We can play with some of our other settings as well. Now fortunately, the cool thing about increasing our spacing is it allows certain other aspects to become a lot more apparent. For instance, hardness. As I increase hardness, you can see in the preview what that's doing. 100% is a perfectly hard brush, 0 is a very soft brush. Next we have roundness. Now I can punch in a number here, but it's much easier for me to just click and drag on the roundness word, and you can see what that's doing. That's taking each one of those stamps and kind of stretching them out. If I increase my spacing, it becomes a whole lot more apparent. So instead of circles now, I'm getting little ovals. I can also adjust the angle. So I can tilt these, say, somewhere around 45 degrees. Now watch what happens if I really crush down the roundness. And now let's slow down the spacing. I can get kind of a calligraphic brush effect. Like so. So you can see how it kind of gets thinner when you move upwards at a 45-degree angle. Now we can, you've already seen the size. We can flip the X or flip the Y of each stamp, and you can see how that's affecting our result. If I increase the spacing, it might become a little easier to see. So there it is flipping X. Here it is flipping Y, or we can flip them both, which kind of puts us right back where we were. So there's a quick rundown of the brush tip shape options. Now you can change these for each one of the individual presets, as you can see. We also have a series of other controls. Now anytime you see the word dynamics, that means that this is a setting that could potentially change in the middle of your brush stroke. So let's jump down and take a quick look at shape dynamics. You can control things like size jitter. Jitter is a word you're going to see repeated over and over throughout this window. What jitter means is that value is going to fluctuate throughout your brush stroke, meaning it'll constantly be wavering around. And the question is, how much wavering do you want to take place? I'm going to hit Control-Alt-Z to remove that brush stroke we had. And watch this. I'm going to take my size jitter. Actually, let me jump back up to brush tip shape, and I'm going to change a few things just so that this will be a little more apparent. Let's take roundness and set it back up to 100%. Let's take spacing and pull it down slightly to right about here. And angle is going to be irrelevant because each stamp is perfectly circular. Let's go back down to shape dynamics. Now watch as I increase size jitter. Each one of these stamps is getting a randomized size. So we got some big dots and we have some little dots. It becomes a lot more obvious if I get a much bigger brush. So we go from big dots to little dots all over the place. That's what jitter is doing. It's just kind of jumping this around. Now, aside from jitter, you also have the ability to control that. So jitter is random, but control is something where you can actually specify to Photoshop, hey, I want this to be controlled by something, and you have a list of different things. You can set it to pen pressure, pen tilt, the stylus wheel if you have one, or to fade. Pen pressure is a common one, but you will get a little warning from Photoshop, which tells you that control by pen pressure requires the use of a pressure-sensitive tablet. Now, fortunately, I happen to have one of these. But with this set up, with size jitter turned on, a very, very light stroke gives me tiny little dots. A much harder stroke gives me great big dots, as you see there. Now, to kind of help this, I'm going to turn my spacing back down a little bit. Let's hit Control-Z, and I'll just do this one more time. So a very light stroke, and I'm gradually pushing down harder and harder as I go. And there you go. You can see how size is being affected. So let's hit Control-Z and get rid of that. So there's shape dynamics. Now you can do an angle jitter, which that goes all the way back to the angle that we saw here. You can make that automatically jitter around, or you can slave that to a different control. We have roundness jitter. Again, that's just the same as your roundness, and you can make that flip around, or you can control that as well. Now let's go ahead and switch that off, and we can go down to scattering. Scattering is going to take all those little stamps of your brushstroke and just spread them out in various directions. You can choose to spread them on the X and both the Y axes at the same time, and you can control the amount of scatter. Now, if you switch off both axes, you're only scaling out perpendicularly to your brush stroke. Now, it's going to be a little hard to see at that size, so let me go ahead and just bring my size way down. So we're still kind of going in a straight line, and those stamps are being scattered to the left and to the right of my brush stroke. If I switch on both axes, they're also being scattered forward and back, so we end up with some more gaps, though it is a little bit of a subtle effect in this particular case. You can also control the count, which will be how many stamps you get. If we increase the scatter and increase the count, we get a result of a much thicker brush stroke made of a whole lot more dots. And then we can also jitter that count as well, so that count can constantly be in fluctuation. We can apply a texture to our brush stroke, which is generally something I find myself not doing that often. I mean, it's really kind of a specialty case kind of thing for me, but yeah, your mileage may vary. We don't have a whole lot of textures installed in Photoshop at the moment, so I'll just stick with the one that's there by default. I'm going to make sure that my mode is set to multiply, and I'm going to increase the size of my stroke just to show this off. And as I click and drag, you'll see that there is indeed a pattern, a texture that's been applied to my brush stroke. And we can control the size of that pattern. If I really increase this and adjust it, you'll see how that's actually changing here inside the preview. We can change the blend mode for that. Now again, I haven't really talked specifically about blend modes. That's something that we're going to handle in an entirely separate video. You can control the depth or how much of that pattern is being applied. You can also jitter that depth as you go. Now let's go ahead and turn off texture, and I'll hit Control-Alt-Z to get rid of that brush stroke. The dual brush settings allow you to choose a second brush that will be applied to your existing brush. So if we start off with just our basic soft round, but then we increase the spacing a little bit, we can now go down to dual brush and choose an entirely separate brush which will be applied to this as well. And so as I increase the spacing, you can see the results of that second brush taking place inside there. So let me actually bring my spacing back down, and you can see the results of the two kind of combined together. Next we have color dynamics. Now remember, dynamics insists that, well, that suggests, that the color is going to be changing as you go. So you have an amount of foreground background jitter, which is going to become a lot more apparent if I choose some much more dramatic colors. So let's go from red to green. So obnoxious red to obnoxious green. And if I set my foreground background jitter all the way up, and let's go ahead and turn off pen pressure, you see that our brush stroke is constantly oscillating between red and green, which looks pretty hideous, but that's the way it works. Now we can turn that jitter back down to 0, and we can attach that to pen pressure. And let me go ahead and make my brush a whole lot bigger. So if I make a really faint stroke, we're painting in green, and the harder I push, we gradually shift over to red. So at full pressure, we're now painting red. So you can see how that works. We can also jitter the hue, saturation, brightness, and purity of the color. Let's go ahead and take care of this and just undo. Now all I did there was hit Control-Alt-Z a few times to get rid of those brush strokes. Next we have transfer. This controls how the paint is being applied to the canvas. So remember earlier in a previous video over painting I talked about opacity and how you can control the see-throughness of each individual stroke. You can jitter that value as you move your brush around. So if I was to increase this, some of those stamps are at full opacity and others are very, very low opacity, and it just kind of randomly chooses a new opacity for each individual stamp. You can do the same thing with your flow for your airbrush as well. Now let's jump down from here. We have some other kind of Boolean options that are just kind of on and off. They don't have their individual settings. We have noise, and you can see what that does here inside the preview. It just adds noise to the edges of your brush stroke. A very, very cool effect. We have wet edges, which is going to accentuate the outer edges of your brush stroke, which is kind of cool. So as I paint like this, it really gives kind of a watercolor style effect where the water tends to kind of wash away the paint in the middle and leave it really just at the outer edges, or it starts to really kind of coalesce out there at the edges. Just go ahead and close that off. We have airbrush, which is just like turning on airbrush mode. As a matter of fact, as I turn that checkbox on and off, you'll see the button getting pressed. If you are wanting to play with that, please understand that you really ought to turn flow down first, otherwise you won't get a significant result out of that. Next we have smoothing. This is a little hard to show, so if you're playing with it on your own and you're not seeing a result from it, do not be alarmed by that. It's one of those things that can be a little bit tricky to see, but I'm going to do my best to show it off. I'm going to make a pretty small hard brush, and I'm using a digital stylus as I mentioned earlier, and I'm going to make a really, really fast stroke. So let's go wah, like so. And that's pretty good. Let me make it a little curvier, so bear with me here. Let's go like so. Okay, cool. That's exactly what I want to see. If you look really closely at this stroke, in fact, let me hit the D key for now just to go back to black and white, and I'll go down. If you take a look, areas like right here, and right here, and right here, and right here, you'll notice that these little tiny corners that are pointing up. I can zoom in on them, make them a little more apparent. You see how we're getting these, it's almost like a connection of straight lines that are taking place. That's because this brush stroke is the result of my computer trying to interpolate the motion of my hand as I sweep it across my digital tablet. Now, if I go back to my brush, let's make that nice and big again, right about where it was, and I'll go ahead and make it red again so we have the same value to compare with. Now if I turn on smoothing and do something very similar, I'm sure I won't get the exact same stroke, but I'll give it a try. There you go. Notice there are no corners here to look at. and I can go really, really fast, and I'm not getting any corners. You may notice there is a very slight lag in feedback when you do that. Of course, the faster your computer, the less lag you're going to experience. But that's because Photoshop is doing a little bit more work to interpolate what's actually going on with each brushstroke, and it's a way to alleviate those corners. Finally, we have Protect Texture. If you are using the texture setting up here and you have multiple tips that are being textured, this will make sure that that texture pattern is consistent between your strokes, so that you don't end up with a whole bunch of different patterns getting in each other's way. It's a really nice way to make sure that the pattern appears nice and smooth and contiguous across your canvas while you work. So that's just a quick rundown of the various brush settings you have access to. I highly recommend you get in here and play with some of these. If you have one on a brush that you don't want to accidentally bump or change, please note that you have a lock button which will lock that setting in place and keep it from being updated. Next, we have our brush presets. I just want to mention these kind of in passing. These are the same as the brush presets we had here in this drop-down box. So it's just another way to choose those, but the cool thing about choosing them in here is you get a nice little demonstration path that shows you what this is actually going to look like, which is very cool, but you can change the size of each individual one when you select it. Also gives you the ability to jump into the brush panel if you like. And one more thing it gives you access to, kind of buried down at the bottom, if you hadn't looked, is you can create your own preset, which would just be clicking here, giving it a name, and then you can start changing the size of it. You know, if you want to have a go-to preset that you like for later on. I generally don't do that, but you can. Then at the bottom we can open up the preset manager. I just kind of want to mention this guy in passing. This allows you to control all of the different presets that are within Photoshop, and it's not limited to just brushes. We've seen a lot of the brush presets. We've been playing with these. You can double click on one and you can rename it. You can load in new presets. You can rename a preset. You can save out a set of presets, but notice that this doesn't just limit itself to brushes. You have your swatch presets as well. So you can save those out. You have patterns, styles, contours, tools, and so on. So even right down to your various brush settings. They're all loaded in here. So if you have like a certain preset that you're done with and you don't want to bump into or accidentally choose anymore, you can delete it out. In fact, in an earlier video, I created this nice little green swatch, but if at some point I decided, you know, that's just kind of getting in the way and it's redundant, I've got some perfectly good green swatches all around here, I can just select that, hit delete, and it removes out that preset. So I just wanted to mention the preset manager as sort of a quick thing, just, you know, without really going too hardcore into it. So that is a rundown of the brush panel and all the various settings you have for your brushes. By all means, take a little bit of time and play with those settings and get accustomed to them. However, that is going to wrap things up for this video. Thanks a lot.